What does it take to survive a world that never wanted you to exist? Her mother was executed before she turned 3. Her father erased her name from the royal record. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, and sent to live in a modest household far from court. And yet this forgotten child grew up to become one of the most powerful rulers in European history. Tonight we trace the entire story of Queen Elizabeth I, from her birth under a shadow to her death as a legend. But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. Drop it in the comments below. Now let's begin. Picture England in the autumn of 1433. The Thames runs silver and cold beneath a grey October sky. Greenwich Palace rises from the riverbank, its white towers catching the last of the morning light. Inside, a kingdom holds its breath. Henry VIII has gambled everything on this moment. He broke with Rome. He dissolved a marriage that had lasted 24 years. He defied the Pope, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the better judgment of nearly every advisor he had. He tore his church from its foundations and built a new one from scratch. All of it, every last brick of that enormous, violent wager, rested on one thing: a son, an heir, a boy to carry the Tudor name forward. On September the 7th, 1533, a child is born at Greenwich Palace. The king is not in the room. It is a girl. The letters announcing the birth had already been drafted. They used the word prince. Someone crossed it out, added an S. The jousting tournament Henry had planned in celebration, cancelled. The name chosen for a boy, set aside. In its place, a girl's name, Elizabeth, named after 2 grandmothers. Elizabeth of York, who had brought peace to a war-torn dynasty, and Lady Elizabeth Howard, her mother's mother. 2 women whose strength ran quietly through the blood of this new child. Nobody in that room could have known how much she would need it. Her mother was Anne Boleyn. Dark-eyed, sharp-witted, magnetic in a way that made men nervous and kings reckless. Henry had pursued her for nearly 7 years. He had rewritten the religious map of Europe to make her his queen. Anne had survived longer than anyone expected, navigating a court that viewed her as an interloper, a commoner, elevated beyond her station. She had given Henry 1 child, the wrong one, and in a court where a king's patience was the only currency that mattered, that debt would come due faster than anyone imagined. The infant Elizabeth was baptized 3 days later, on September the 10th. The ceremony was held with full royal ceremony. Her godparents were Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Henry Courtenay, the Marquis of Exeter. A canopy was carried over the child by her uncle George Boleyn and 3 noblemen. The incense in the chapel would have been thick, sweet, catching in the throat. Candles everywhere, prayers spoken in Latin, the old language of a church that England was already in the process of abandoning. It was a strange, contradictory moment. A Protestant future wrapped in Catholic ceremony, carried in the arms of a woman whose position was already beginning to crack. Elizabeth was the heir presumptive to the English throne. Her older half-sister Mary had already lost her place in the succession when Henry annulled his marriage to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon. Now Mary was declared a bastard, and Elizabeth was first in line. It should have been a position of enormous power. But power in the Tudor court was never stable. It shifted with the king's mood, with his desires, with the next woman who caught his eye, and Henry's eye was already beginning to wander. Anne Boleyn had one more pregnancy. It ended in miscarriage. The child, had it lived, would have been a boy. That loss sealed something in Henry. His patience, already thin, snapped. The machinery of a Tudor court in motion against a queen was a terrible thing. Quiet at first, whispers, then accusations, then arrests. In April of 1536, Anne Boleyn was taken to the Tower of London. The charges against her were adultery and treason. The names of the men she was accused of sleeping with included her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were almost certainly false, but false charges in a king's court carry the same weight as true ones, sometimes more. The smell of the tower in spring was river mud and damp stone, and something else underneath it all. Something cold and final that everyone who entered its gates could feel in their chest. Anne's trial lasted 2 days. The verdict was never in doubt. She was found guilty and condemned to death. On May the 19th, 1536, she walked out onto the scaffold on Tower Green. She wore a grey damask gown. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath her hood. She spoke to the crowd gathered below her. She said she had come to die according to the law. She said nothing against the king. She knelt. And it was over. Her daughter was 2 years, 8 months, and 12 days old. 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. The speed of it was its own kind of brutality. Within months, Parliament passed the Second Succession Act. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate. Her title of princess was stripped away. She was no longer Her Royal Highness. She was simply Lady Elizabeth, a child without a mother, without a title, and without a father willing to claim her. She was sent to Hatfield House, a modest red brick manor in Hertfordshire, far from the noise and danger of court. Her household was reduced. Her circumstances were humbled. She was not yet 3 years old, and already the world had arranged itself around her absence. But here is what the court did not account for. Children absorb everything. They may not have words for what they experience. They may not be able to name the fear that settles into their small bodies when the adults around them grow quiet and careful. But they feel it, in the way their governess speaks to them, in the way certain subjects are never mentioned, in the way a mother's name disappears from conversation, as completely as if she had never existed. Elizabeth's first governess, Margaret Bryan, wrote of the child that she was as toward a child and as gentle of conditions as ever I knew any in my life. Gentle, forward, already showing the careful, watchful quality that would define her for the rest of her days. In 1537, a new governess arrived at Hatfield. Her name was Catherine Champernowne, known later as Cat Ashley. She would stay at Elizabeth's side for nearly 30 years. She would become the closest thing to a mother the girl had ever known. Meanwhile, Jane Seymour gave Henry what Anne had not. In October of 1537, a son was born, Edward, the undisputed heir. The king wept with joy. Jane Seymour died 12 days later from complications of childbirth. Henry mourned her for months, wearing black long after the court had moved on. The irony was not lost on those watching. The woman who had lived was the one he discarded. The woman who had died, giving him his son, became the love of his life in memory. Elizabeth was given a role at her half-brother's christening. She carried the chrism, the baptismal cloth, in the procession. a child of 4, dressed in ceremony, performing duty for a family that had officially erased her. The image is almost unbearable. A small girl walking in a formal procession, carrying cloth for a brother whose birth had further diminished whatever claim she had left. And yet, look at her. She walks. She does not stumble. She does not cry. She carries the cloth. That quality, that refusal to collapse under the weight of what was being done to her, was not something she learned from a book. It was something forged in the specific silence of a household where her mother's name was never spoken, where the question of what had happened to Anne Boleyn sat in every room like smoke that nobody acknowledged. How does a child make sense of a mother who simply vanishes? There is no record of anyone explaining it to Elizabeth. No letter survives. No account from Cat Ashley of the conversation. Perhaps there was no conversation. Perhaps the adults around her simply moved forward, the way adults do, and left the child to build her own understanding from the wreckage of what she could see and feel and hear in the spaces between words. What she could see was this: her mother was gone. Her father had another wife. Her title had been taken. She lived in a house that was comfortable but not grand, attended by servants who were loyal but careful. And the world beyond Hatfield's walls was one where a woman's survival depended entirely on the favor of a man who had already shown what he did to women who disappointed him. She was 4 years old. She had already learned the most important lesson of the Tudor court. Nothing is permanent. Nothing is safe. And the people who love you cannot always protect you. Henry VIII would eventually restore Elizabeth to the line of succession when she was 10 years old. He would acknowledge her again, cautiously, as his daughter, but he would never speak publicly of Anne Boleyn. He would never explain to Elizabeth what had happened. He would leave that wound open and unaddressed, and she would carry it forward into every room she ever entered, into every negotiation, every courtship, every decision about whether to trust another person with her safety. The Tower of London at dusk casts a long shadow across the Thames. In the fading light, the stones look almost warm, almost welcoming. But stone holds cold the way no other material does. Press your hand against it, and the chill moves straight through your palm into your bones. Anne Boleyn was executed on a Tuesday morning. Her daughter was 2 years, 8 months, and 12 days old. Elizabeth would never speak publicly of this day. But everything she became, every decision, every armor she ever built around herself, began here, in a silence a child had no words for yet. Lady Bryan's letter arrives in Thomas Cromwell's office sometime in the autumn of 1536. It is not a formal petition. It is not a carefully composed diplomatic document. It is a woman writing in something close to desperation, explaining that the child in her care has no proper clothes, no cap, no gown suitable for her age, no clear instructions from anyone in the royal household about how she is even to be addressed now that the word princess has been stripped away. That letter is the sound of a political catastrophe landing on a small body. Elizabeth was 3 years old. Her mother had been dead for months. Her father had already remarried. And somewhere in the machinery of Henry's court, the question of what to do with the inconvenient daughter of an executed woman had simply fallen through the cracks, not out of cruelty exactly, out of something almost worse, indifference. Lady Bryan was not indifferent. She had served the royal nursery for years, a steady and devoted woman who had helped raise children before Elizabeth. She knew what a royal child was owed. and what Elizabeth was receiving fell far short of it. So she wrote to Cromwell. She asked for guidance on Elizabeth's title. She asked for proper staff. She asked with a kind of quiet urgency that makes the letter painful to read even now, for clothing. Basic, ordinary clothing for a little girl who had none that fit. Think about what that means. Not abstractly, concretely. A child who woke each morning in a house that was comfortable enough, attended by servants who were loyal enough, but who had no cap to wear, no gown that suited her station, no one with clear authority to tell the world who she was. The erasure of Anne Boleyn had been so swift, so total, that it had swept the child up in its wake. Elizabeth did not lose her mother and keep everything else. She lost her mother and then watched everything attached to her mother's name dissolve around her. She was learning at 4 years old what it felt like to be inconvenient. The smell of Hatfield House in those years would have been wood smoke and damp stone. The ordinary smell of an English country house in autumn and winter. The sound that filled her days was not the grand noise of court, not trumpets or ceremony, but the quieter sounds of a small household. Footsteps on flagstone floors. The low voices of women talking in the next room. The wind against the windows. A child growing up in the margins of power does not grow up in silence exactly. But she grows up listening to things that are not meant for her. And then, in October of 1537, the world shifted again. Jane Seymour gave Henry VIII a son. Edward, the longed-for male heir, the boy the king had destroyed 2 marriages and 1 woman's life to produce. When the bells rang out across London for Edward's birth, they were ringing for something Elizabeth could feel even at 4 years old, even without the words to name it. Her position, already marginal, had just become more so. She had been the daughter of a disgraced queen, illegitimate, stripped of her title. Now she was also the sister of the undisputed heir, the boy who would one day be king. Jane Seymour died 12 days after Edward's birth. Childbed fever. Henry wept for her in a way he had not wept for anyone. Elizabeth carried the baptismal cloth at her brother's christening, a small figure in a ceremony built to celebrate everything she was not. She was placed in Edward's household. She was near the center of power and completely outside it at the same time. The years that followed were years of watching. Henry married again. Catherine Howard was young, perhaps 16 when she became queen. A girl barely older than a child herself. She lasted 2 years before the accusations came, the charges of adultery, the arrest. And then, in February of 1542, the axe again. Elizabeth was 8 years old. She had now seen the pattern twice. A woman enters the king's favor. A woman falls. A woman dies. The mechanism was the same each time. Only the name changed. No one sat Elizabeth down and explained this to her. No one needed to. She was watching. She had been watching since before she had words for what she saw. And what she saw was a court that ate women alive when they stopped being useful, when they failed to produce what was required, when they became inconvenient. She had been born inconvenient. She had been born inconvenient. She had spent her entire childhood being managed and overlooked and occasionally remembered. The lesson was not theoretical. It lived in her body, in the careful way she moved through rooms, in the stillness she learned to wear like armor. Then came Catherine Parr. Henry's 6th queen arrived in 1543, and did something none of the others had thought to do, or had the security to attempt. She gathered the king's children together: Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, 3 people who shared a father and almost nothing else, who had grown up in separate households, navigating separate dangers, were brought under one roof. Catherine Parr made them a family, or the closest thing to one that Henry's court could produce. For Elizabeth, now 9 years old, this was not a small thing. Catherine Parr was warm without being naive. She was educated, genuinely so, a woman who read and thought and took ideas seriously. She looked at the girl in front of her, the quiet, watchful, red-haired daughter of Anne Boleyn, and saw something worth cultivating. Not just a political asset, a mind. She commissioned an education for Elizabeth that was serious in a way that almost nothing else in Elizabeth's life had been. William Grindal came first, a skilled and patient tutor who taught her French and Greek, alongside the Latin and Italian she was already learning. The curriculum was humanist in the fullest sense, not decorative accomplishment, the kind of learning designed to make a girl marriageable, real intellectual formation, the kind reserved in that world almost exclusively for boys. By the age of 11, Elizabeth was writing in multiple languages with a fluency that startled people who encountered her work. By 12, she translated her stepmother's own religious writing, prayers or meditations, from English into Italian, Latin, and French, and presented it to her father as a New Year's gift. Henry received it. He did not speak of Anne Boleyn. He never spoke of Anne Boleyn, but he acknowledged the work. He acknowledged the daughter. And for Elizabeth, who had spent years being acknowledged by no one, that mattered. Roger Ascham came later, a tutor who believed that learning should feel like discovery rather than punishment. He wrote about Elizabeth in his memoirs with something close to awe. He had taught many students. He had not taught one quite like her. She read with hunger. She read with hunger. She argued with precision. She retained everything. The girl who had once had no proper clothing was becoming, quietly and without fanfare, one of the best educated people in England. But education was not the only thing Catherine Parr gave her. She gave her consistency. A household that did not dissolve overnight, a woman who remained present, who did not disappear or get arrested or find herself replaced. For a child who had watched the women around her vanish one after another, this was not nothing. This was everything. The cold that lived in Elizabeth's bones was not the cold of Hatfield's stone floors, though those were cold enough on winter mornings. It was the cold of understanding, at an age when most children understand very little, that safety is conditional, that love is not protection, that the people who hold power over you can withdraw everything without warning, and the world will simply rearrange itself around the gap they leave. She had learned this at 2 years old. She had spent every year since then gathering evidence that confirmed it. Catherine Parr gave her something to push against that knowledge with. Not certainty, not the naive belief that things would always be well, but a reason to build herself into something formidable enough to survive whatever came next. A girl's mind, Catherine Parr believed, was worth educating, worth the investment, worth the time. That belief was a radical act in 1543. Elizabeth carried it forward like a weapon. Henry VIII died in January of 1547. He died as he had lived, enormous in his appetites and his destructions, leaving behind a kingdom and 3 children who would each, in their own time, sit on his throne. Elizabeth was 13. She had survived his court by being small, careful, watchful, and brilliantly educated. She had survived it by learning to read silence, to inhabit margins, to offer nothing that could be used against her. Now the man who had ordered her mother's death stripped her title, ignored her existence, and finally, cautiously, restored her to the line of succession, was gone, and the protection Catherine Parr had wrapped around Elizabeth. The warmth, the consistency, the radical act of taking a girl's mind seriously was about to become the most dangerous thing in her life. Because Catherine Parr would not be alone for long, and the man she chose next would look at the 13-year-old Elizabeth and see something that had nothing to do with her mind at all. The house at Chelsea smelled of beeswax candles and fresh ink. Latin conjugations drifted through the corridors. There was laughter at mealtimes. For the first time in Elizabeth's life, the place she slept in felt like somewhere she was meant to be. Then Henry VIII died. He died in January of 1547, enormous and rotting, and feared to the last. His 9-year-old son became Edward VI. His older daughter, Mary, stood second in the line of succession, and Elizabeth, 13 years old, stood third. Not a queen, not forgotten. Somewhere in between, as she had always been, she stayed in Catherine Parr's household at Chelsea, and for a few weeks, the warmth held. It did not hold for long. Catherine Parr had loved before Henry. Long before she was maneuvered into a royal marriage she had not chosen, she had loved Thomas Seymour. He was the younger brother of Edward Seymour, now Lord Protector of England and the most powerful man in the kingdom. Thomas had the looks his brother lacked, and the charm his brother had never bothered to develop. He was tall, bold, easy in his laughter. He wore his confidence the way other men wore armor. Women noticed him. He knew they did. He came back to Catherine within weeks of Henry's death. He was 40 years old. She was 35. They had wanted each other for years, and now there was nothing standing between them. They married in secret sometime in the spring of 1547. The council was not pleased. The ink on Henry's will was barely dry, but Catherine had lived through too much to wait any longer for a life she actually wanted. Elizabeth was living in that house when Thomas Seymour moved into it. She was 13 going on 14, red-haired and quick-minded, and she had spent her entire childhood learning to read rooms and people with the precision of a scholar. She had been educated by some of the finest minds in England. She could argue philosophy, translate Latin, and write letters in 3 languages. She had survived a court that had destroyed her mother, discarded her, and then cautiously reclaimed her. She knew what danger looked like. She did not yet know what it looked like when it smiled. Seymour started coming to her bedchamber in the mornings. Early, before she was dressed, before her ladies had prepared her for the day. He would throw open the curtains, laugh, slap her on the back or on the backside, the way you might greet a much younger child, or the way a man might reach for something he has already decided belongs to him. Sometimes Catherine Parr was with him. That is the detail that is hardest to sit with. In the beginning, Catherine came too, as if this were a game, as if the noise and the intrusion were simply high spirits, the roughhousing of a boisterous household. Elizabeth's ladies watched. They said nothing. What could they say? The mornings continued. The touching continued. On one occasion, Seymour took a pair of scissors and cut Elizabeth's dress into pieces while Catherine held her still. It was framed as play. It was not play. Elizabeth was a princess of England, third in line to the throne, and a grown man was cutting the clothes from her body while her stepmother laughed. She was 14 years old. The smell of the room on those mornings, the cold air through the curtains, the sound of his footsteps in the corridor. These became things she learned to brace against before she heard them. Catherine Parr eventually stopped laughing. The moment that ended it is recorded with a terrible plainness. Catherine came upon Thomas and Elizabeth together in an embrace. Some accounts say she found them in each other's arms. Whatever she saw, it was enough. She sent Elizabeth away. Not Thomas. Elizabeth, the girl who had finally found a home, was removed from it. Quietly, efficiently, the way you remove a problem rather than a person. Elizabeth went to live in the household of Sir Anthony Denny at Cheshunt. She was 14. She wrote Catherine a letter full of careful, formal affection, the kind of letter that gives nothing away. She had learned that skill early. She used it now. Here is what no one said out loud. Catherine Parr was not a villain. She was a woman who had spent years surviving the same court that had destroyed so many others. She had been Henry's nurse as much as his wife, managing his rages and his illnesses with extraordinary patience. She was intelligent, she was generous, and she had genuinely loved Elizabeth. But she had also, in those early morning visits, participated in something she should have stopped immediately. And when the cost of stopping it fell on someone, it fell on Elizabeth. It always fell on Elizabeth. Catherine Parr died in September of 1548. She had finally had what she wanted, a child with the man she had chosen freely, and it killed her. Childbed fever, 6 days after delivering a daughter. She was 36 years old. Elizabeth, 15 now, and living away from the household, received the news of her stepmother's death. The woman who had taught her that a girl's mind was worth educating, who had wrapped her in the first consistent warmth she had ever known, was gone. And the man responsible for Elizabeth's removal from that warmth was now a widower. Thomas Seymour did not grieve for long. Within months, he was moving on multiple fronts simultaneously, the way ambitious men do when they sense a shift in the landscape. He was already undermining his brother's authority as protector. He was already building a faction, and he had not forgotten Elizabeth. He began making inquiries about the possibility of marrying her. He sent her gifts. He worked through intermediaries to access her income. He was positioning himself, as he always did, to convert proximity to power into something he could use. The council arrested him in January of 1549. The charges against Thomas Seymour were broad and serious. He had attempted to control the young king, his nephew. He had undermined the protectorate. He had plotted. The treason charge was built from many pieces, and Elizabeth was one of them. The council wanted to know everything. They sent Sir Robert Tyrwhitt to question her, and Tyrwhitt was not gentle. He told her that her governess, Cat Ashley, and her cofferer, Thomas Parry, had already confessed. He told her they had said things that implicated her. He was trying to break her. She did not break. Tyrwhitt wrote back to the council with something close to frustration. He reported that Elizabeth had a great wit and nothing would come from her except what she chose to give. She wept sometimes when pressed hard enough. Tears were permitted. Tears were not an admission. She answered every question with precision, acknowledging what could already be proven, conceding nothing beyond it. She was 15 years old, being interrogated about whether she had conducted a treasonous relationship with a man who had entered her bedchamber uninvited for months. The humiliation of it was enormous. The danger was real. Treason touched everyone near it. She wrote a letter to the protector himself, Edward Seymour, Thomas's brother, now sitting in judgment over the man who had cut her dress and held her in the early morning cold. The letter is a masterwork of controlled language. She addressed the rumors that she was pregnant with Seymour's child, rumors that were circulating in London with the speed and cruelty that only court gossip achieves. She demanded that the rumors be publicly denied. She argued her own innocence with a clarity and a force that no one expected from a 15-year-old girl. She was not asking for mercy. She was demanding justice and framing the demand so carefully that it could not be refused without making the council look worse than she did. Thomas Seymour was executed on March the 20th, 1549. He went to the block without confessing, without breaking, and without naming Elizabeth as anything more than a young woman in a household where he had behaved badly. Whatever else he was, and he was many bad things, he did not destroy her on his way out. She received the news of his death with the composure that was becoming her primary instrument. One of her ladies reported that Elizabeth's only comment was that he had died a man of much wit and very little judgment. 14 words, perfectly chosen, nothing given away. She had learned something in those months that no tutor could have taught her. Not Roger Ascham with his Greek, not Catherine Parr with her belief in the educated female mind. She had learned it in the cold of early mornings, in the grip of a man who saw her as a piece in a game, in the interrogation room where a council official tried to frighten the 15-year-old girl into confession. She had learned that her body was political, that her reputation was a weapon others would try to pick up and use against her. That warmth, offered freely, could be turned into a trap. That the people who should protect you will sometimes be the first ones to step aside. When the interrogators from the council finally finished questioning Elizabeth about Seymour, they reported back to the protector that they had found nothing to charge her with. She had answered every question with a composure that unnerved men twice her age. She was 15 years old. She had just watched her stepmother die, her protector executed, and her reputation nearly destroyed. And she had learned something she would never unlearn. Trust no one with your vulnerability. The mask she put on in that interrogation room she would wear for the rest of her life. Rain on the Thames. That is what she hears first. Not the oars of the barge cutting the water, not the voices of the guards, not the distant bells of the city going about its ordinary morning. Just rain, falling on the river, on the stones, on the ancient timber of the gate ahead. It is March the 18th, 1554. Elizabeth is 20 years old, and the barge is carrying her toward Traitor's Gate. She has known this moment was coming. For weeks, the council had circled her, looking for a thread they could pull. A rebellion had erupted in January and February, led by a man named Thomas Wyatt, a Protestant uprising against her sister Mary's plan to marry Philip of Spain. Wyatt's men had marched on London. They had failed, and in the wreckage of that failure, the council had turned its eyes on Elizabeth. Some of the rebels had approached her. That much was true. She had not answered them. But not answering is not the same as not knowing, and in the minds of men who wanted her removed, the difference hardly mattered. Now the barge scrapes against the stone steps. The guards move, and Elizabeth does not stand. She sits there in the rain. The water soaks through her clothing. Her hands are cold against the wood of the barge. She looks at the gate, at the dark arch of it, at the water running black beneath it. And she speaks. She says that she is no traitor. She says she does not deserve to enter here. One of her attendants weeps. The guards wait. The rain keeps falling. She cannot stay on the steps forever. She knows that. Her body knows it before her mind accepts it. She rises. She walks through the gate, and the door closes behind her with a sound that has no echo because the stone swallows it whole. Think about what she is carrying into that gate. Not just fear, though the fear must be enormous. She is carrying the memory of a woman who walked through this same entrance 18 years earlier, Anne Boleyn, her mother, who did not walk back out. The Tower of London is not simply a prison. It is a message. Sending someone here is a statement about what you intend to do with them. Mary's closest advisor, the Imperial Ambassador Simon Renard, had been direct about it. He told Mary plainly that her throne would never be safe while Elizabeth lived. Lord Chancellor Stephen Gardiner was working to build a case for trial. The machinery of execution was not hidden. It was the point. But here is what Mary did not have. Evidence. The Wyatt Rebellion had collapsed without producing a single document connecting Elizabeth to the plot. No letter, no messenger who would testify under oath, no thread she had left behind. And that absence was not accidental. It was the product of everything Elizabeth had learned in the cold interrogation rooms of her adolescence. In the months when Thomas Seymour's recklessness had nearly dragged her down with him. She had learned how to leave no trace. She had learned that warmth is a liability, and that paper is a weapon your enemies can pick up and use. So, she had written nothing, said nothing, done nothing that could be held up in a courtroom and named as treason. But absence of evidence had not saved her mother, and Elizabeth knew that too. Inside the tower, she waits. Days pass. The smell of the place is stone and damp, and something underneath both of them. Something older, something that has soaked into the walls over generations of people who came here and did not leave. Her legs ache from the cold of the floors. She sleeps badly. She eats what is brought to her and says little. And then she is brought to write a letter to Mary. This is the moment. Not the arrest, not the gate, not the guards. This. Because a letter to Mary is the only weapon she has left, and it has to be perfect. Not so pleading that it looks like guilt, not so composed that it looks like contempt. It has to be the letter of a loyal sister who cannot believe she is suspected, who is desperate but dignified, who asks only for the chance to speak face to face before any judgment is made. She writes it on the stairs. The story survives, specific and vivid enough to feel true. She writes slowly, choosing each word with the precision of someone who has been trained since childhood to understand that language's power. She leaves a large blank space at the bottom of the final page, and she draws lines through it so that no one can add words beneath her signature and change the meaning of what she has written. She has thought of everything. She is 20 years old, and she has thought of everything. The letter does not save her. Mary does not come. But it may have helped to slow the machinery, because the letter is the act of someone innocent, or at least someone who can perform innocence so completely that the performance becomes its own kind of protection. Meanwhile, inside the court, a quieter battle is being fought on her behalf. William Paget, one of the men on the council, pushed back against Gardiner. Without evidence, he argued, a trial would be dangerous, not for Elizabeth. For Mary, an execution without proof would turn Protestant England against the Queen at a moment when she needed her subjects' patience. Gardiner wanted Elizabeth dead. Paget wanted stability. And in that tension, Elizabeth survived. But she did not know that, sitting in the Tower, she did not know who was arguing for her or whether they were winning. She had no way of knowing. All she had was the mask, the composure, the face that gave nothing away. This is what the Seymour years had built. Not courage in the heroic sense, something harder and more useful than courage. The ability to perform calm when everything inside is screaming. The ability to wait without breaking. The ability to look at the gap between you and death and not fill that gap with words that could be used against you. She had been 15 when she learned it. She is 20 now, and it is the only thing standing between her and her mother's fate. Edward's reign had set all of this in motion. When Henry died in 1547, the Protestant reforms accelerated under the young king and his protectors. England was being remade. The Latin Mass went. The old images came down from church walls. The country was pulled, rapidly and not always gently, away from the faith it had practiced for centuries. And when Edward died in 1553, aged 15, that remaking stopped. He had tried to prevent it. His will set aside the Succession Act, ignored both Mary and Elizabeth, and named Lady Jane Grey as his heir. She was Protestant. She was controllable. She lasted 9 days. The country did not want her, and Mary rode into London in August of 1553 with Elizabeth at her side, the people cheering them both. That solidarity did not last. Mary was a devout Catholic, deeply, personally, painfully devout, in the way of someone who had spent years watching her faith be stripped away and had never stopped grieving it. She moved quickly. The Catholic Mass returned. Protestant reforms were reversed, and Elizabeth, who had been educated as a Protestant, who had grown up reading Tyndale and translating scripture with Catherine Parr, was suddenly a liability simply by virtue of who she was. She outwardly conformed. She attended Mass. She gave Mary no open cause for complaint, but she was Protestant England's heir, whether she asked to be or not. Every person who resented Mary's religious policies looked to Elizabeth. Every plotter who wanted a different future put her name in their plans without asking her permission. She was a symbol before she was a person, and symbols cannot always control what they mean to the people who need them. The Wyatt Rebellion was the most dangerous expression of that. Wyatt's men had risen specifically against Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain. A Spanish king, consort on the English throne, was the nightmare that united Protestants, nationalists, and everyone who feared what a Catholic Habsburg alliance would mean for England's future. The rebellion failed, but its failure left Elizabeth exposed, standing at the center of a circle of suspicion, with nothing but her own, carefully maintained silence to protect her. And now she is in the Tower, and the silence has to hold. It holds for 2 months. She is never charged. The council cannot find what does not exist. Gardiner pushes, Renard pushes, and the evidence simply is not there. A trial without evidence is a murder with paperwork, and even Mary, who genuinely believed Elizabeth was dangerous, cannot quite bring herself to sign the warrant without something to point to. In May of 1554, the door opens. Not the traitor's gate. The other door. She walks out into light and air, and the smell of the river in spring, and the people who see her along the road to Woodstock call out to her, cheer for her, reach toward the carriage as if touching it might mean something. She does not wave back extravagantly. She does not weep. She sits and receives their affection with the same composure she has worn for 2 months in the Tower. She has learned that being loved publicly is its own kind of danger when your sister is queen and watching. Woodstock is house arrest, guarded, watched, her letters read before they reach her and after they leave. She is not free. She is simply not dead. And for now, that is everything. Mary has not given up. She cannot find the evidence to kill Elizabeth, but she has not stopped looking, and across the Channel, something is changing that will reshape everything. Philip of Spain is about to become England's king consort. The marriage Mary has planned, the marriage that sparked the rebellion that put Elizabeth in the Tower, is going to happen, and Elizabeth's survival now depends on a question no one can answer yet. Whether that marriage produces an heir. If Mary has a child, Elizabeth's place in the succession disappears. She becomes irrelevant, then inconvenient, then perhaps something worse. If the marriage produces nothing, if Mary's body does not deliver the heir that would secure the Catholic succession, then Elizabeth waits, watched, guarded, suspected, but alive. And alive, as she has already learned, is the only position from which anything is possible. The room she lived in at Woodstock was cold, not dramatically cold, just the persistent, grinding cold of a medieval building that had been falling apart for decades, where the wind found gaps in the stone that no one had bothered to seal. Her books were limited. Her correspondence was read before it left, and read again when it arrived. Sir Henry Bedingfield, the man appointed to watch her, was not cruel. He was simply thorough. And thoroughness, when you are the one being watched, feels like its own kind of cruelty. She was 20 years old. She had survived the Tower. She had walked out into spring air and heard crowds calling her name. And now she was here, in a crumbling palace in Oxfordshire, with guards at every door and a keeper who reported everything back to a queen who still wanted a reason to sign the warrant. So she picked up a diamond ring, and she scratched words into a window pane. Much suspected by me, nothing proved can be. Read that slowly. That is not the writing of a frightened girl. That is a legal argument. That is a woman who has absorbed every interrogation, every accusation, every attempt to trap her into a confession, and distilled it down to 9 words. She is not weeping into the glass. She is carving a defense. She is practicing the language of survival. This is what Woodstock gave her. Not freedom, not comfort, not safety. It gave her time, and she used every hour of it. The surveillance was relentless. Bedingfield controlled what she could read, who she could speak to, what letters she could send. She had to petition him for permission to write to the council about her own situation, and even those letters passed through his hands first. The smell of the place was damp stone and old wood, the kind of smell that settles into your clothes and stays there. She could not move freely. She could not plan openly. She could not be seen to be anything other than a loyal, obedient, Catholic-attending subject of her sister, the Queen. So that is exactly what she was. Visibly, demonstrably, carefully. She attended Mass. She attended it with the kind of composed regularity that gave no one anything to point to. Across England, Mary's regime was burning people alive for refusing to do the same thing. Nearly 300 Protestant men and women would die in the fires of Mary's reign, their names recorded afterward by the martyrologist John Fox. Bishops, ordinary tradesmen. A 17-year-old apprentice. They burned in town squares while crowds watched, some weeping, some cheering, some simply standing in silence because there was nothing else to do. The smell of burning flesh carried on the wind for miles. Elizabeth did not burn. She bent. This is the part that is easy to judge from a distance and almost impossible to judge fairly. She did not stand up and declare her Protestant faith. She did not become a martyr. She folded her hands, bowed her head, and walked into Catholic Mass week after week while the fires burned elsewhere. Some historians have called this cowardice. Others call it calculation. The truth is simpler and harder than either word. She wanted to live. And she had learned by 20 years of watching people die for being inconvenient that living required concealment. But here is what matters. She was watching everything. She was watching how Mary governed, how a queen who ruled by fear rather than consent lost her people's love, how the burnings, which Mary intended as purification, became in the public mind something closer to atrocity, how Philip of Spain, the husband Mary had staked her reign on, arrived in England, married her, and then spent as little time in the country as he possibly could. How the marriage that was supposed to produce an heir, that was supposed to secure the Catholic succession forever, produced nothing. In 1554 and 1555, Mary believed she was pregnant. The court prepared. The country waited. Elizabeth was recalled to court in April of 1555 to attend the final stages of what everyone expected would be a royal birth. If Mary delivered a healthy child, Elizabeth's path to the throne narrowed to almost nothing. She stood in those rooms and waited, and the waiting must have felt like holding your breath at the bottom of a very cold lake. The child never came. The pregnancy dissolved into nothing, into the particular silence of a court that had been holding its collective breath and now had to exhale without showing relief or disappointment. Mary was not pregnant. She had never been pregnant. And in that moment, the entire political landscape of England shifted on its axis. No one said it aloud. No one needed to. Philip left England. He had what he needed from the marriage politically, and he had not gotten what he wanted from it personally. Mary was left with a country that was turning against her, a faith she was enforcing through fire, and a body that would not give her an heir. She grew ill, slowly, then faster. By 1557 and 1558, the deterioration was visible to anyone paying attention. She suffered what was likely uterine or ovarian cancer, though no one called it that. She grew thin. She held on to the throne with a grip that was becoming increasingly desperate because letting go meant Elizabeth. And Elizabeth was at Hatfield. She had returned there in October of 1555 after the phantom pregnancy collapsed and her presence at court became unnecessary. Hatfield House was where she had grown up, where she had learned Latin and Greek and French and Italian, where she had translated Cicero and read Tacitus and become, quietly and without anyone quite noticing, one of the most educated people in England. Now she returned to it, not as a child but as an heir in waiting, and she began, carefully and without any announcement, to build something. William Cecil came to her. He was 35 years old, meticulous, brilliant, a man who had survived the reigns of Henry and Edward and Mary by being indispensable rather than ideological. He looked at the political situation with the same cold clarity that Elizabeth had learned to apply, and he began working with her, not loudly, not in any way that could be reported back to Mary as treason. But the conversations happened. The plans took shape. She was assembling piece by piece. the architecture of a government she did not yet officially have permission to lead. Philip of Spain sent an envoy to consult with her in 1558. The Count of Feria arrived at Hatfield and met a woman who was calm, informed, and entirely in command of the room. Philip had already done the calculation. Mary was dying. Elizabeth was the heir. Mary, Queen of Scots, the Catholic alternative, had grown up in France and was about to marry the French Dauphin, which made her a French instrument rather than a Spanish one. Elizabeth, Protestant and English, was the better ally, so Philip cultivated her, and she received his envoy with the same composed, measuring attention she brought to everything. By October of 1558, she was already making plans for her government. On the 6th of November, Mary named Elizabeth her heir. She had no other choice. The evidence that had never been enough to convict her was still not enough, and the body that had never produced an heir had finally made the decision for her. Mary signed the recognition with the same hand that had signed 300 death warrants, and then she let go. 11 days later, on November the 17th, 1558, Mary died. She was 42 years old, childless. Her reign defined in the popular memory by the fires she had lit and the husband who had barely stayed. The messenger rode to Hatfield. Elizabeth was sitting under an oak tree in the park, reading. When they told her, she quoted from the Psalms, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." Then she stood up. Think about what she carried into that moment. Abandoned at 2 years old, declared illegitimate, subjected to the unwanted hands of Thomas Seymour at 14, interrogated, imprisoned, nearly executed, watched, read, reported on, suspected for 4 years without a single charge that would hold. She had survived all of it by becoming unreadable, by folding herself small enough to pass through every trap, by learning, in the long cold silence of Woodstock and the careful years at Hatfield, how to wait without breaking. The waiting was over, but the girl who had survived by hiding was now going to have to step into the most visible position in England, with every eye in Europe turning toward her at once. She had learned to conceal. Now she would have to reveal, and no one, not even Elizabeth, could be certain yet what would be left when the mask finally came off. The streets of London smelled of wood smoke and river mud and something else. Something harder to name. Anticipation, maybe. Or relief. It was January the 14th, 1559. The coronation procession moved through the city, and the crowds pressed so hard against the barriers that the wood bent. These people had lived through 6 monarchs in 25 years. They had watched their neighbors burn for one faith, then burn for another. They had learned not to love their rulers too loudly, because the rulers kept changing, and now here came a 25-year-old woman in a golden litter, dressed in cloth of gold, her red hair loose under a crown, moving through streets strewn with herbs that crushed underfoot and sent up a sharp green smell into the cold January air. What the crowd saw first was the theatre of it. Elizabeth had always understood theatre. She had studied it the way other people study survival, because for her, they were the same thing. Every gesture in that procession was deliberate. Every pause was chosen. An old woman reached through the crowd and held out a sprig of rosemary. The litter stopped. Elizabeth took it. She held it for the rest of the procession. A child handed up a Bible. Elizabeth pressed it to her chest with both hands. She looked at the crowd when she did it. She let them see her face. That was the thing about Elizabeth in those first hours of visible power. She had spent years learning to be unreadable, to fold herself into silence, to survive by revealing nothing. Now she had to reverse every instinct she had developed. She had to be seen. She had to be legible. And watching her that January day, you would not have guessed how hard it cost her. She laughed when the crowds cheered. She wept openly when a choir of children sang. She stopped the procession again and again to speak to ordinary people pressed against the barriers, leaning down from the litter, her face close to theirs. She was performing, but the performance was not false. That was the genius of it, which she had inherited. Beneath all the gold and the cheering was a wreck. England's treasury was empty. The country carried debts from Mary's disastrous wars. The military was weak and underfunded. Calais, the last English territory in France, had fallen the previous year, a humiliation that had reportedly broken Mary's heart. And now every Catholic power in Europe was watching this Protestant girl take the throne, calculating how long she would last, measuring the distance between London and Rome. The religious question was the most urgent. England had been Catholic, then Protestant under Edward, then Catholic again under Mary. 3 reversals in 11 years. Parishes had ripped out altars and put them back. Priests had conformed, then refused, then conformed again. The country was not just divided, it was exhausted by division. Elizabeth moved carefully. On Christmas Day 1558, before the coronation, she attended Mass and instructed the bishop not to elevate the host during the consecration. He refused. She stood and walked out before the consecration was complete. It was a small gesture. It was also a declaration. When Parliament opened in January 1559, the work began in earnest. The Act of Supremacy re-established the Church of England's independence from Rome. Parliament gave Elizabeth the title of Supreme Governor of the Church of England, not Supreme Head, as her father had claimed. Governor. The distinction mattered. It was quieter, less offensive to Catholics who could not accept a woman leading the church, and less offensive to Protestants who believed only Christ could be head of any church. Elizabeth had found the precise word that most people could live with. The Act of Uniformity brought back the Book of Common Prayer. But the version Elizabeth authorized was deliberately blurred at its sharpest edges. The words spoken during communion were revised so that a Catholic priest could hear in them an affirmation of the real presence of Christ in the bread and wine, while a Protestant could hear a memorial service. Both could perform the same ceremony and believe different things about what it meant. It was theologically ambiguous by design. Elizabeth had no interest in making windows into men's souls. She wanted a church that most of England could attend without feeling damned. It was a middle way. Critics on both sides hated it. Puritans thought it reeked of popery. Catholics thought it was heresy, dressed in familiar vestments. But Elizabeth was not building a church for theologians. She was building a country, and a country requires people who can share a room. The settlement did not end the argument. Nothing could have ended the argument, but it gave England a framework, a space inside which most people could breathe. That was not nothing. After the previous 2 decades, it was close to a miracle. Parliament, meanwhile, had opinions about something else entirely. They wanted her to marry. The pressure began almost immediately. It came from every direction, from her council, from foreign ambassadors, from the House of Commons. which formally petitioned her on the matter in 1559 with the kind of earnest urgency men deploy when they are trying to solve a problem they do not quite understand. The problem, as they saw it, was simple. She was a woman. Women died in childbirth. She needed an heir. England needed continuity. The suitors arrived in a parade that would have been comic if the stakes had not been so high. Philip of Spain, her dead sister's husband, offered himself first. Elizabeth declined with the kind of gracious warmth that left him no obvious insult to respond to. Archduke Charles of Austria was proposed, negotiated over, considered, and ultimately deflected across years of careful diplomatic non-commitment. There were others: princes, dukes, foreign kings. Elizabeth received their ambassadors, smiled, asked questions, expressed interest, and decided nothing. She was not being coy. She was being strategic. Every suitor she kept in play was a foreign power she kept from becoming an enemy. Every engagement she refused to commit to was a card she kept in her hand. The marriage question was not a personal inconvenience. It was one of the most powerful tools she possessed, and she used it with the precision of someone who had watched from childhood exactly what marriage did to the women in her family. But there was one name that was not a diplomatic calculation. One face that appeared in the council chamber and did not stay where politics could contain it. Robert Dudley had known Elizabeth since childhood. They had been imprisoned in the Tower at the same time, two young people under suspicion, breathing the same cold stone air. He was handsome in the way that makes other men uneasy. He was also married. By 1559, Elizabeth was making him master of the horse. By 1560, the court was talking. Ambassadors were writing letters home about the Queen and Lord Robert. The Spanish ambassador reported that she visited his chamber morning and night. Cecil, who loved Elizabeth with the fierce protective loyalty of a man who has staked his life on her success, was alarmed. He told the Spanish ambassador privately that he was considering resignation. That was the measure of it. Then, in September 1560, Robert Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in their country house. She had been alone. The servants had been sent away. Her neck was broken. The court went very quiet. An inquest ruled it an accident. Nobody believed the inquest. Nobody could prove otherwise. The rumors ran in every direction at once. Some said Dudley had arranged it to free himself for the Queen. Some said Elizabeth had arranged it. Some said it was suicide. Some said it was suicide. Some said Amy had been ill and simply fallen. The truth has never been established with certainty. What is certain is what it cost. Cecil told Elizabeth plainly that if she married Dudley now, the scandal would destroy her reputation across Europe. Foreign powers would use it. Her enemies would use it. She would hand them the weapon herself. Elizabeth heard this. She sat with it, and she did not marry Robert Dudley. But she did not send him away either. She made him Earl of Leicester in 1564. She kept him close for the rest of her life, closer than was entirely explicable by politics, closer than was entirely comfortable for anyone around her. Whatever existed between them resisted the categories available to describe it. It was not nothing. It was not quite everything. It existed in the space between where Elizabeth had learned to live. By the early 1560s, the foreign threats were sharpening. Scotland was the immediate pressure. The French had troops there, supporting the Catholic regent Mary of Guise, and a French-controlled Scotland was a knife pointed at England's northern border. Elizabeth sent an English fleet north in 1560. The French were expelled. The Treaty of Edinburgh established Scottish Protestant rule, and waiting behind that treaty, watching from France with cool, dark eyes, was Mary, Queen of Scots. Catholic, young, widowed after the death of her husband, the King of France, and by the reckoning of every Catholic power in Europe, the legitimate Queen of England, because in Catholic eyes, Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn had never been valid, which meant Elizabeth had never been legitimate, which meant the throne was Mary's. 2 queens, 1 island. The equation would not balance for long. Elizabeth had stabilized her religion. She had assembled her council around the steady intelligence of William Cecil. She had deflected most of her suitors with a diplomatic grace that kept them hopeful and kept England safe. She had managed Scotland. She had survived the first years without war, without rebellion, without the collapse that her enemies had predicted and her allies had feared. But in the autumn of 1562, everything nearly ended in a different way entirely. She fell ill with smallpox. The fever came fast. Within days, she was unconscious. Her physicians were not certain she would survive. The council gathered, because that is what councils do when a monarch is dying and there is no named successor. They gathered and they talked about what would come next. Who would come next? The names of possible successors moved around the room. Plans were made. Contingencies were discussed. Elizabeth recovered. The fever broke. She came back to herself slowly, in stages, the way you return from a very long distance. And then she was told what had happened in her absence, what her men had been doing while she lay insensible, how quickly they had begun the conversation about her replacement. She did not shout. She did not weep. She looked at the faces of the men around her, the men she had chosen, the men she had trusted, the men who had spent the days of her illness calculating the odds on her successor. Something settled in her then. Something that had perhaps always been waiting to settle. She had survived her mother's execution. She had survived Thomas Seymour and the Tower and Woodstock and 4 years of Mary's reign. She had survived by learning with absolute precision who could be trusted and how far and under what conditions. And now she had learned something new. She had learned that even the men closest to her, even the men who served her faithfully, were always also serving themselves, were always also calculating, were always also ready for the world without her. She already knew, in some abstract way, that power was lonely. Now she felt it in her body, in the dry, cold clarity that comes after a fever breaks, and you look at the room around you and see it differently than you did before. She pushed harder on the succession question, demanding Parliament name no heir without her consent. She turned the vulnerability she had just displayed into a weapon, using her near death to remind every faction in England what instability looked like, what the alternative to her was. She had almost disappeared, and what she saw when she looked at the people around her changed something in her permanently. The girl who had learned to survive by becoming invisible had become a queen who understood that her visibility was her power, the woman who had been trained by years of danger to trust no one completely, now led a country that required her to perform trust every day for every audience in every chamber and procession and formal address. She would keep performing. She was very good at it. But in 1562, in the quiet aftermath of the fever, Elizabeth looked at her council and understood, with the full weight of lived experience, that she would always be alone at the center of it, that the crown sat on one head, that the decisions ultimately fell to one person, She had almost lost everything to a staircase of invisible cells multiplying in her blood. She had survived again. Robert Dudley remained at court, warm and dangerous and unresolved. Mary, Queen of Scots, sat across the border, beautiful and legitimate and patient. The religious settlement held, but only just, with Puritans pulling at one thread and Catholics pulling at another. England was stable, but stability, Elizabeth had learned, was not a condition. It was a performance, and a performance never ended. Picture a portrait, young woman, perhaps 25 years old, auburn hair, pale skin, eyes that look directly at you with a composure that feels almost too perfect, like someone who has practiced calm until it became real. She is dressed in the finest French fashion. She holds herself like what she is, a queen who has already been queen of 2 countries before most women her age have buried a husband. Mary, Queen of Scots. And Elizabeth knew exactly who she was. She knew that Mary had been crowned Queen of Scotland at 9 months old. She knew that Mary had grown up at the French court, educated in 6 languages, celebrated for her beauty and her height and her grace, married to the Dauphin of France at 15, Queen of France at 16. She knew that Mary had once quartered the arms of England with her own, claiming Elizabeth's throne openly, publicly, as if it were simply a matter of waiting. She knew that Mary was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII. She knew that every Catholic in Europe looked at Mary and saw the rightful Queen of England. She also knew what had happened next. Mary had come home to Scotland, a widow at 18, stepped into a country she barely recognized, and proceeded to make one catastrophic choice after another. She had married Lord Darnley, a vain and dangerous man who helped murder her secretary in front of her while she was 6 months pregnant. She had then married the man widely believed to have blown up her husband. She had watched her nobles rise against her, imprisoned her, forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son. And then, on the 16th of May 1568, Mary, Queen of Scots, had crossed the Solway Firth in a fishing boat, landed on the English shore at Workington, and sent a letter to Elizabeth asking for help. Elizabeth read that letter and made no sudden moves. That was her gift. That had always been her gift. What she faced was a problem with no clean solution. Support Mary and risk war with Scotland's Protestant lords. The very people who kept Scotland stable and Protestant. Send Mary back to Scotland and watch her possibly be executed, setting a precedent that made Elizabeth's own stomach turn. Send her to France and hand the Catholic powers a living, breathing, legitimate claimant to the English throne. Or keep her in England. Elizabeth kept her in England, and England became a cage. The air in the rooms where Mary lived for the next 18 years smelled of beeswax and damp stone and the particular staleness of a life lived indoors. Mary moved from Carlisle Castle to Bolton Castle to Tudbury to Sheffield to Chartley, always inland, always distant from the sea, always watched. She was allowed her own staff, her own chefs, her own tapestries. She embroidered constantly. She kept a small dog hidden in her skirts. She wrote letters in cipher to every Catholic power in Europe, and Elizabeth's spymaster Francis Walsingham read every single one. 2 queens, 1 country, and the country could only hold one of them. But in the 1560s, while Mary was still crossing borders and losing kingdoms, Elizabeth was fighting her own war. Not with armies. With the question every man in England seemed to think he had the right to answer for her. Who will you marry? Robert Dudley remained at the center of it. Warm, handsome, familiar. The man who had known her since childhood, who had been imprisoned in the Tower at the same time she had, who had shared the particular knowledge of what it meant to be young and hunted and alive through sheer fortune. She had moved his bedchambers next to her own apartments in 1559. She loved him. That much was visible to everyone. Her council watched it with barely concealed alarm, and foreign ambassadors wrote home about it, with something between fascination and contempt. Then, in September 1560, Amy Dudley fell down a flight of stairs and died. The country's whispers became a roar. Murder, people said. The Queen's favourite had cleared the way. Elizabeth held completely still while the scandal broke around her. She could not marry him now. To marry him now would be to confirm every accusation, to hand her enemies a weapon sharper than any sword. She held still, and the moment passed, and Dudley remained at court, raised to the earldom of Leicester in 1564. Still beloved, still impossible. She considered marrying him for years. Her council made their opposition unmistakably clear. William Cecil told her plainly that the nobility would rise, and Elizabeth, who had survived by reading rooms correctly since she was 14 years old, read this room and stepped back from the edge. She did not stop loving him. That note she kept among her most personal belongings until the day she died, marked in her own handwriting, his last letter, tells you everything about what she chose to bury and keep buried. What she built instead was something more durable than a marriage. She began, quietly and then with increasing deliberateness, to construct an identity. Not Elizabeth the unmarried queen, with all the vulnerability that implied. Something else. Something that turned the absence of a husband from a political weakness into a kind of sacred power. In 1559, she had told Parliament that a marble stone would one day declare she had lived and died a virgin. At the time, it sounded like a young queen deflecting pressure. By the late 1570s, it had become something much larger than a deflection. Poets wrote about her as a goddess. Portraits showed her in white, untouchable, celestial. The cult of the Virgin Mary had been stripped from English churches by the Reformation, and something had to fill that space in the national imagination. Elizabeth filled it, deliberately, brilliantly. That mythology is harder to maintain when a 50-year-old French duke arrives at your court and makes you laugh. Francis, Duke of Anjou, was 22 years younger than Elizabeth. He arrived in England in 1578 as part of a serious diplomatic courtship, and what happened next surprised everyone, possibly including Elizabeth herself. She called him her frog. She wore a frog-shaped earring he sent her. She was seen kissing him in public, which sent her court into barely concealed panic. Parliament's horror was genuine and immediate. A French Catholic prince, a Valois. The thought of it made Protestant England cold with dread. Elizabeth negotiated. She delayed. She did what she always did, which was to keep every option open for as long as humanly possible, to refuse to be pushed into a corner, to use the courtship itself as a diplomatic tool, while the question of whether she actually intended to go through with it remained deliberately, strategically unanswered. But there was something real in it too. She was 45 years old. The succession question had not gone away. If anything, with Mary Queen of Scots sitting in an English castle at the centre of every Catholic plot the continent could devise, the question pressed harder than ever, and Francis made her feel something she had trained herself not to feel for a very long time. She sent him away. She brought him back. Parliament petitioned her formally against the marriage in 1579, and she shouted at the delegation with a fury that cleared the room. Then she wept. Then she continued negotiating. While all of this played out, the north of England had already reminded her what Mary's presence cost. In 1569, Catholic earls, the Earls of Northumberland and Westmoreland, raised the Old Faith's banner and marched south. The Northern Rising. Their goal was to free Mary, marry her to Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, and put her on the English throne. They marched into Durham Cathedral and tore up the Protestant prayer books. The smell of incense filled a church that had been stripped of it for a decade. Elizabeth crushed the rebellion. Over 750 of the rebels were executed on her orders. She was not merciful. She had not survived this long by being merciful when survival was at stake. The Pope responded in 1570 with a papal bull, Regnans in Excelsis. It declared Elizabeth a heretic and a pretended queen, and released every English Catholic from any obligation of loyalty to her. It was, in practical terms, an invitation to assassination. Every Catholic in England was now legally, by the Church's authority, free to consider themselves no longer her subject. Elizabeth absorbed this. She tightened the laws. She watched Walsingham build his network of spies deeper into every household where Catholic sympathies might live, and she kept Mary in her cage, moving her from castle to castle, always inland, always watched. Norfolk lost his head in 1572 for his part in the Ridolfi plot, another scheme to put Mary on the throne with Spanish military support. The plots kept coming. The Throckmorton plot, the Bond of Association in 1584, which committed its signatories to kill anyone who plotted against Elizabeth and to prevent any pretended successor from benefiting from the murder. It was aimed directly at Mary. Parliament wanted her dead. Cecil wanted her dead. Walsingham wanted her dead. Elizabeth refused. She refused for years. She knew what it meant to execute an anointed queen. She had been a princess in a kingdom where queens were executed. She knew what that precedent looked like from the inside. And she was afraid of something else too. Mary's son James sat on the Scottish throne. James had alliances. James had a claim to England after Elizabeth. If Mary died on Elizabeth's order, James might turn to the Catholic powers and invite an invasion. She kept refusing, and Walsingham kept watching. By the early 1580s, the Anjou courtship was over. Francis had left England for the final time in February 1582. Elizabeth wept at his departure. She wrote poetry about it. She wore a miniature portrait of him for months afterward, close to her body, the way you carry something you know you were losing, and then she sealed it away. She was past 50. She would not marry. Not Francis. Not anyone. The decision was not announced with ceremony. It did not need to be. The mythology had been building for 20 years, and now it simply became permanent. The Virgin Queen, married to England itself, wedded to her people, to her kingdom, to the performance that had kept her on her throne through smallpox and rebellion and papal excommunication, and the constant gravitational pull of the woman in the castle who was everything she had refused to be. Mary had married for love and watched it destroy her. Mary had married for strategy and watched that destroy her too. Mary had been beautiful and impulsive and brave and catastrophically human in a world that punished queens for being human. Elizabeth had watched all of it from across a border and then from across a corridor, and she had drawn her conclusions. The Virgin Queen was not a surrender. It was not a consolation. It was the most ruthless political transformation of the century. Elizabeth had taken the one thing that everyone in Europe saw as her weakness, her failure to produce an heir, her refusal to bind herself to any man, and she had turned it into a kind of sacred invulnerability. You cannot threaten what has already been consecrated. You cannot destabilize what has already been made mythological. She was very good at it. She had been very good at it for a very long time. But mythology does not neutralize a woman who has been writing letters in cipher to every enemy you have. It does not dissolve the plots. It does not make the threat disappear. And in 1586, Walsingham finally had what he needed. Letters. Deciphered, clear, unambiguous. Mary, Queen of Scots, had sanctioned the assassination of Elizabeth. The Babington plot. There it was, in ink, in Mary's own hand, or close enough to it that the court of 36 noblemen who tried her in October of that year had no serious doubt. Mary was convicted on the 25th of October, 1586. She was sentenced to death, and Elizabeth, who had refused to sign the warrant for months, who had wept and raged and asked her jailer to simply find some quiet way to end it without her signature, finally took the pen on the 1st of February 1587. By 1581, Francis of Anjou had left England for the last time. Elizabeth wept, wrote poetry about it, wore a miniature of him for months, and then she sealed it away. She was 47 years old. She would not marry. She had transformed what began as political necessity, the impossibility of finding a husband who would not diminish her power, into something else entirely, an identity, a mythology, a brand. The Virgin Queen, married to England itself. It was the greatest performance of her reign. But in the shadows of that performance, Mary, Queen of Scots, was still alive, still writing letters, still the center of every Catholic plot against the English throne, and Elizabeth was running out of reasons not to act. The document sat on her desk for weeks. Vellum, black ink, the Great Seal of England pressed into wax at the bottom. Official and irreversible and waiting. Elizabeth had picked it up and set it down more times than anyone in her court could count. She had wept. She had raged. She had asked, through intermediaries, whether there was some quieter way, whether her jailer at Fotheringhay could simply find a moment, a dark corridor, a cup of something, whether the problem could dissolve without her name on it. It could not. On the 1st of February, 1587, she took the pen. Was it grief? Was it political calculation? Was it the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been outmaneuvering this exact moment for 19 years and had finally run out of room? Probably all three, wound together so tightly that even Elizabeth herself could not have told you where one ended and the next began. What we know is this. She had spent her entire life running from her mother's fate. Anne Boleyn, convicted on evidence that bent toward the desired verdict, beheaded at the Tower when Elizabeth was 2 years old. And now Elizabeth, at 53, had just sent her cousin to the same scaffold. Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on the 8th of February, 1587. She wore red, the color of Catholic martyrdom. She had planned her exit the way Elizabeth had planned everything, as theater, as message, as the last word in an argument that had lasted 2 decades. When her head was lifted by the executioner, her lips were still moving. The witnesses said it took 3 blows. When the news reached Elizabeth, she erupted. She claimed she had never authorized the warrant to proceed. She turned on her secretary, William Davison, the man who had carried the signed document to the council, and had him thrown in the Tower. Davison had followed her instructions. Everyone in the room, knew it. Elizabeth knew it too. But she needed someone to blame, needed a theatre of outrage, needed the watching courts of Europe to see a queen horrified by what her own hand had set in motion, whether she genuinely grieved, or whether the tears were the performance of a woman who had learned very young that visible feeling was a kind of armor. You cannot say with certainty. Perhaps she could not say either. What you can say is that the woman who signed that warrant had grown up knowing what a scaffold looked like from the inside of a royal family. She had walked past her mother's ghost her entire life, and now she had become the hand that held the axe. She did not have long to sit with it. Across the English Channel, Philip II of Spain had been watching. He had watched the execution of Mary. He had watched Francis Drake raid Cadiz in 1587, sailing into the harbour and destroying the Spanish fleet of warships that Philip had been assembling for what he called the enterprise of England. Drake called it singeing the King of Spain's beard. Philip did not find it amusing. He accelerated his plans. On the 12th of July, 1588, the Spanish Armada set sail. 130 ships, the largest invasion fleet the Atlantic world had ever seen. Philip's plan was precise. The Armada would sail up the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army waiting in the Netherlands, ferry those troops across to the southeast coast of England, and end the Protestant experiment on the island once and for all. End Elizabeth, end the Church of England. Return the kingdom to Rome. The smell of tar and salt water hung over the English coast for days before anyone saw a sail. Beacons lit up across the hilltops from Cornwall to London, fire passing hand to hand across the dark, the oldest alarm system in the world still doing its work. In Plymouth Harbour, the English fleet under Francis Drake and Charles Howard made ready. The ships were smaller than the great Spanish galleons, faster, built for maneuvering rather than for the broadsides of a pitched naval battle. What followed was not a single decisive clash. It was a week of running engagements up the Channel. The English fleet harrying the Armada's flanks, unable to break its tight defensive formation. The Spanish unable to shake the faster English ships, then anchored off Gravelines in the early hours of the 28th of July. The Armada faced something it had not prepared for. Fire ships, 8 English vessels, stripped of their crews and packed with pitch and gunpowder, set alight and sent drifting on the tide into the anchored Spanish fleet at midnight. The Spanish captains panicked, cut their anchor cables. The tight formation broke apart, and in the chaos that followed, the English guns found their targets. The Armada never recovered. Storms caught the scattered fleet as it tried to circle north around Scotland and back to Spain. Ships broke apart on the rocks of Ireland. Men who made it ashore were killed. Of the 130 ships that had sailed from Spain, perhaps 67 limped home. Thousands of men were dead. But Elizabeth did not know any of this yet, not on the 8th of August, when she rode to Tilbury in Essex to inspect the English militias assembled to defend against an invasion that, as it happened, would never come. She wore a silver breastplate over a white velvet dress. She rode among the men on horseback. The ground was muddy. The air smelled of horses and wood smoke and the particular anxious sweat of soldiers who had been waiting too long. She looked at their faces. And then she spoke. "I know I have the body, but of a weak and feeble woman," she told them. "But I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." She told them she thought foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of her realm. She stood in front of 80,000 soldiers and made them feel, for a few minutes, that the island they were standing on was the center of the world and that she was its beating heart. It was the greatest speech of her reign. It might be the greatest speech any English monarch ever gave, and it was delivered to soldiers defending against an invasion that was already, though no one knew it, broken and running. When the news finally came, the celebrations were extraordinary. Elizabeth's procession to a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral rivaled her coronation as spectacle. The portraits that followed showed her as Gloriana, the eternally youthful queen, ageless, divine, unconquerable. The defeat of the Armada became the defining image of her reign. God had blown with his winds, the commemorative medals said, and they were scattered. She was 54 years old. She had perhaps 15 years left, and they would be harder than anything that came before. The men who had built her reign were leaving. Francis Walsingham, the spy master who had caught Mary Queen of Scots in her own letters, who had run the intelligence networks that kept Elizabeth alive through 20 years of Catholic conspiracy, died in 1590. He died in debt, having spent his own fortune on the Queen's service. Robert Dudley, Leicester, the man she had loved since childhood, the man whose last letter she would keep among her most personal belongings until her own death, had died in 1588, just weeks after the Armada's defeat. William Cecil, Lord Burghley, who had been at her side since the first day of her reign, who had counselled her through every crisis for 40 years, died on the 4th of August, 1598. Each death took something from her that could not be replaced. Not just the political counsel, the memory. These were the people who had known her when she was young, when she was afraid, when the throne was new and uncertain, and the world was trying to take it from her. When they were gone, she was alone in a way that no amount of courtly flattery could touch. Into that loneliness stepped Robert de Vere, the Earl of Essex. He was Leicester's stepson. He was young, reckless, beautiful in the way that men who have never learned restraint can be beautiful, burning with a kind of intensity that looked, from a distance, like passion and looked, up close, like something far more dangerous. Elizabeth was 33 years older than him. She knew better. She forgave him things she had forgiven no one else. When Essex returned from a military expedition to France in January 1592, having accomplished essentially nothing, Elizabeth wrote that she had no idea where he was or what he was doing. She was furious. Then he came back to court, and she forgave him. When he clashed with Robert Cecil, Burghley's son, who was quietly consolidating power in the council, Elizabeth watched the rivalry with the particular tension of a woman who could not quite bring herself to choose between them. When Essex was given command of a fleet and sacked Cadiz in 1596, capturing the city and burning 30 Spanish ships, he became a hero. His prestige rivaled hers. She accused him of distributing knighthoods without authority and pocketing Spanish treasure. She was angry, and then she forgave him. The pattern repeated itself, each cycle tightening like a knot. In 1598, Essex was sent to Ireland to put down the 9 Years' War, the most serious rebellion her reign had ever faced in that kingdom. Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, backed by Spanish gold and Spanish troops, had been fighting Elizabeth's forces to a standstill for years. Essex arrived with the largest army England had ever sent to Ireland. He achieved almost nothing. He made a truce with O'Neill that Elizabeth had not authorized, and then, in September 1599, In direct defiance of her explicit orders, he abandoned his command and rode hard for London. He arrived at Richmond Palace unannounced on the morning of the 28th of September, burst through the doors before Elizabeth had dressed, and found her without her wig, without her makeup, without the armor of the royal image. The face he saw was the face of a 66-year-old woman, the woman behind the icon. He fell to his knees and covered her hands with kisses. She was, by all accounts, initially gentle with him. By that evening, she had placed him under house arrest. She stripped him of his offices. She deprived him of his monopolies, the income streams that had kept him solvent. She did not yet move against him legally. She was still, somehow, trying to hold the door open. Essex could not stop himself from walking through it the wrong way. On the 8th of February 1601, he rode into the City of London with a group of followers, calling on the citizens to rise against the men he claimed were misleading the Queen. He intended to seize Elizabeth. He intended to force the council's hand. He believed that if he could only get to her, if he could only make her see what her advisors were doing, she would stand with him. No one rose. The city watched and did nothing. Essex rode through empty streets, the sound of his horse's hooves on the cobblestones, the only answer to his call. He retreated to his house. By nightfall, he was under arrest. His trial lasted 2 days. The verdict was never in doubt. He had raised rebellion against the crown. The sentence was death. Elizabeth signed the warrant. Witnesses who were present described no visible hesitation. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was executed on the 25th of February 1601. He was 33 years old. What happened to Elizabeth in the months that followed is recorded in the accounts of those who watched her. She sat in the dark. She wept, and Observer wrote in 1602 that her delight was to sit in darkness, sometimes shedding tears to bewail Essex, the woman who had built an entire mythology around the sublimation of personal feeling into political identity, was sitting alone in an unlit room, crying over a man she had executed. The court around her was changing in ways she could not control. Robert Cecil, quiet and methodical where Essex had been loud and reckless, had already begun his coded correspondence with James VI of Scotland, preparing the succession that Elizabeth would never name. The Queen, who had kept every faction guessing for 40 years, was being quietly managed by the man she had always thought of as the lesser Cecil. Her body was failing. Her teeth were gone, so many of them that foreign ambassadors reported struggling to understand her speech. Her skin had been scarred by smallpox decades earlier, leaving her dependent on wigs and cosmetics that the portraits no longer bothered to represent accurately. The painted images of Elizabeth in her final years show a woman who has stopped aging entirely, a face of perfect symbolic geometry, ageless and iconic and utterly unlike the real face that Essex had seen that September morning at Richmond. Walter Raleigh, who had known her for decades, said she was a lady whom time had surprised. In the autumn of 1602, a series of deaths among her friends pushed her into a depression that she could not climb out of. In February 1603, Catherine Carey, Countess of Nottingham, died. Elizabeth had known her all her life. The grief settled into her bones like cold. She stopped eating. She sat on cushions on the floor for hours, motionless, staring at nothing. When Robert Cecil told her she must go to bed, she turned on him with the last flash of the old fire. "Must," she said, "is not a word to use to princes, little man." She died on the 24th of March 1603 at Richmond Palace between 2 and 3 in the morning. She was 69 years old. James VI of Scotland was proclaimed King of England within hours. Her coffin was carried downriver at night on a torch-lit barge. At her funeral, the chronicler John Stowe recorded that the crowds who came to watch her pass were so great that when they saw her effigy lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing and groaning and weeping as the like had not been seen in the memory of man. The mythology had worked. In the end, it had worked almost too well. The woman had disappeared entirely into the icon, and when the icon was carried through the streets of London on a black-draped hearse, the people mourned something they had never quite been allowed to see clearly. They mourned the performance. They mourned the legend. The actual woman, the one who sat weeping in the dark after Essex died, the one who had stood at her mother's grave in her mind every day of her reign, the one who had been 2 years old when the world first tried to destroy her, that woman they had never fully known. She had made sure of it. But the armor had a crack in it. It had always had one. And Robert Devereux had found it, pressed his hands into it and pulled. After his death, Elizabeth was reported to wear his ring. Not just any ring, the ring she had given him years before with a promise that if he ever needed her mercy, if he ever sent it back to her, she would remember that promise. He had tried to send it. The ring had gone to the wrong person, passed through the wrong hands, and never reached her. She had signed the warrant, not knowing he had tried to reach for her. She had worn that ring until she died. The Queen, who had never allowed herself to be ruled by love, had been waiting all along for someone to destroy her with it. Richmond Palace. Winter. 1602. The fires burned in every hearth, but the Queen would not sit near them. She stood in the middle of her chamber, sometimes for hours, her ladies watching from the edges of the room the way you watch someone standing too close to a cliff. They tried to lead her to bed. She refused. One account survives of what she told them. If they had seen what she had seen in her bed, they would not urge her to go to it. No one recorded what she meant. She did not explain herself. She had never explained herself. 69 years of survival had taught her that silence was armor, and she wore it even now, even here, even when the armor was the only thing left standing. Robert Devereux had been dead for almost 2 years. She still wore his ring. Think about what that means. A woman who had built her entire reign on the image of invulnerability, who had turned her loneliness into a legend, who had made the court believe that she needed no one. And here she stood in the firelight, wearing the ring of the man she had signed to his death. She had not known when she signed the warrant that he had tried to reach for her. The ring he sent as a plea for mercy had passed through the wrong hands. It never arrived. She had worn his ring until she died, and she never stopped wearing it, and nobody dared ask her why. The autumn of 1602 had taken what little remained. A series of deaths among her closest companions pulled her down into a grief she could not perform her way out of. In February of 1603, Catherine Carey died. The Countess of Nottingham, a woman who had been near to her for decades. One more absence in a court that had become a room full of absences. Robert Dudley had been gone since '88. His last letter still folded among her most private belongings, marked in her own handwriting. Francis Walsingham gone, Christopher Hatton gone, William Cecil, her great anchor, her most trusted voice, gone since '98. She was surrounded by younger men now, men who managed her, men who wrote coded letters to James VI of Scotland, coaching him on how to handle her, Robert Cecil, William's son, threading the succession into place behind her back while she stood motionless on a cushion for hours, staring at nothing. When Cecil told her she must go to bed, she turned on him. "Must," she said, "is not a word to use to Prince's little man." She was not wrong, but she was also not sleeping, and she was not eating. And the woman who had once delivered the speech at Tilbury in a silver breastplate, who had made 80,000 soldiers feel invincible with her voice, that woman was sitting in the dark, weeping for Essex. An observer wrote it down in 1602. Her delight is to sit in the dark, and sometimes with shedding tears to bewail Essex. The Queen, who had never allowed herself to be ruled by love, had been waiting all along for someone to destroy her with it. She died on March the 24th, 1603, between 2 and 3 in the morning. Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old. A few hours later, Robert Cecil and the council set their plans in motion and proclaimed James VI of Scotland King of England. The Tudor age ended before sunrise. England barely paused to breathe before moving forward. But the morning came. It came in waves. Her coffin was carried down river at night to Whitehall on a barge lit with torches, the dark water reflecting fire. On April the 28th, the hearse moved through the streets of London, drawn by 4 horses draped in black velvet. John Stowe recorded what he saw. Westminster surcharged with multitudes, people filling the streets and houses and windows and rooftops. And when they saw her effigy lying upon the coffin, there was such a general sighing and groaning and weeping, as the like had not been seen in the memory of man. They were mourning something they could not fully name. Not a woman, not quite. A woman they had never been fully allowed to see. What they mourned was the performance, the legend, the 44 years of stability after the chaos of her father and the terror of her siblings. What they mourned was the feeling that England had been held together by a single will, and now that will was gone. She was laid in Westminster Abbey in the vault of her grandfather, Henry VII. Later, James had her coffin moved and placed a monument above her, her effigy in marble, carved serene and ageless. Below her, in the same vault, lay Mary, her half-sister, the woman who had imprisoned her, who had very nearly had her killed. The Latin inscription on their tomb translates plainly, "Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters in hope of resurrection, 2 queens, 1 stone." The whole brutal Tudor inheritance compressed into a single monument. What came next was something no monarch can plan and no legend can manufacture alone. Within years, the nostalgic revival had begun. By the 1620s, with James on the throne and the court grown cynical and corrupt, people looked back at Elizabeth's reign the way you look back at a house you loved after you have been forced to leave it. Suddenly it glowed. Suddenly it was golden, the triumphalist image she had cultivated in her final years, against a background of economic hardship and military failure and factional bitterness, was taken at face value. Elizabeth was praised as the heroine of the Protestant cause, the ruler of a golden age. James was depicted as a Catholic sympathizer, presiding over a corrupt court. The comparison was not fair. But legends are never fair. But legends are never fair. They are useful. And a legend was extraordinary, not just in the politics, in the culture, because something had happened during her reign that had nothing to do with her patronage and everything to do with the world she had, however imperfectly, held together long enough for it to breathe. William Shakespeare was writing at his peak. Christopher Marlowe before him, Edmund Spenser, John Lyly. The first signs of the new literary movement had appeared at the end of the second decade of her reign, and through the 1590s, some of the greatest names in the English language entered their full maturity. The English theatre reached heights it would not reach again for centuries. She had not caused this. She was never a great patron of the arts. Shakespeare owed her little directly, but she had given England something rare and fragile and almost impossible to sustain. Enough stability for long enough that genius had room to grow. 44 years of a kingdom not consumed by civil war, 44 years of a language that was being written, performed, sung, and argued over in every theatre and tavern and printing house in London. The English tongue was becoming what it would become, and it was becoming it during her reign, under her name, in the age that would carry her as its title. The Elizabethan age, not Henry's England, not Edward's, not Mary's, hers. And then there was the Armada. 1588, the Spanish fleet broken and scattered. The bonfires across England. The procession to St. Paul's Cathedral that rivaled her coronation. She had stood at Tilbury in a silver breastplate over a white velvet dress and told her soldiers she had the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. The defeat of the Armada became the founding myth of English Protestant national identity, and Elizabeth stood at the center of it. God had protected England. God had protected the Virgin Queen. The wind that scattered the Spanish ships became a divine wind, a sign. God blew and they were scattered. That was the medal they struck. That was the story they told. The actual war with Spain continued for 16 more years. The victory was real but not decisive. The counter-armada the following year was a catastrophe. The Irish campaigns drained the treasury. The final years of the reign were marked by hardship and resentment, and the ugly monopolies scandal that forced her to stand before 140 members of Parliament and perform humility she may or may not have felt. None of that made it into the legend. The legend took Tilbury and the Armada and the speech and the portrait with the ermine and the rainbow and the pearls, and it built something that outlasted everything. Pope Sixtus V, her enemy, said it plainly. She is only a woman, only mistress of half an island, and yet she makes herself feared by Spain, by France, by the Empire, by all. Only a woman. He meant it as a qualifier. History took it as the whole point. Because that is the final impossible thing about Elizabeth Tudor. She was born the wrong sex to a condemned mother in a palace that would rather she had not arrived. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title, forgotten in a modest house while her father made and unmade queens. She survived scandal, imprisonment, the shadow of the axe, the loneliness of power, and the loss of every person she ever allowed herself to love. She watched her mother's fate before she was old enough to understand it, and spent the rest of her life making sure no man would ever have that kind of power over her again. She turned her wound into a weapon. She turned her loneliness into a legend. She turned the fact of her own body, female and unmarried and childless, into a cult that outlasted her by centuries. And when she died at 69 years old in the cold dark of a March morning, she left behind a country transformed, a language flourishing, a national myth being born, an empire beginning its first tentative reach across the world. The East India Company had received its charter just 3 years before her death. The name Virginia, perhaps named in her honor, was already on maps of a continent. England was only beginning to imagine. The girl whose name was erased from the royal record became the name the era itself was given. The Elizabethan age, not Henry's England, not Edward's, not Mary's. Hers. The forgotten child had the last word after all.